In the frozen pre-dawn darkness of January 16th, 1947, a man was led to the gallows in Moscow whose bloodline stretched back 7 centuries to the steppes of Mongolia. Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu, a direct descendant of Genghis Khan through the line of Juche, the great conqueror's eldest son, climbed the scaffold not as a Khan or a prince, but as a traitor condemned by the Soviet state. His execution marked the final chapter in a life that had spanned 2 world wars, a revolution, a civil war, and the greatest conflict humanity had ever known. It was a life defined by choices that placed him on the wrong side of history at nearly every turn, and it ended with a rope around his neck in the capital of the very empire his ancestors had once terrorized. To understand how a man of such distinguished lineage came to such an ignominious end requires traveling back to the North Caucasus, to the world that shaped Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu before the old order collapsed. He was born into the Gyre dynasty, the ruling family of the Crimean Khanate, itself a successor state to the Golden Horde that had dominated the Russian principalities for centuries. The Gyres were Genghisids, members of that exclusive club of Central Asian nobility who could trace their ancestry directly to the Mongol emperor. For generations, this bloodline had meant something tangible: power and prestige, and the right to rule. But by the time Sultan came of age, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, those days were long past. The Crimean Khanate had been absorbed into the Russian Empire in 1783. The Gyres and their fellow Caucasian nobility had become, at best, decorated officers in the Tsar's service, their independence a distant memory, their identity preserved more in genealogy than in political reality. Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu embraced the role available to him. He became a cavalry officer, and by the time the First World War erupted in 1914, he had earned a reputation as a skilled horseman and commander. He served in the Caucasian Native Cavalry Division, a unit composed of mountaineers from the North Caucasus, men who shared his heritage and his martial traditions. The division was one of several ethnic formations in the Imperial Russian Army, designed to harness the fighting spirit of the empire's diverse peoples while keeping them organized along familiar cultural lines. Sultan distinguished himself repeatedly. He was awarded decorations for what official commendations described as exemplary service and excellent training of soldiers. By the time revolution consumed Russia, he had achieved the rank of colonel, a position of real authority and respect. Then came 1917, and with it the disintegration of everything Sultan had known. The February Revolution toppled the Tsar. The Bolsheviks seized power in October. The empire fractured into a dozen competing factions, each claiming legitimacy, each willing to fight for it. For Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu, the choice was immediate and unambiguous. The Bolsheviks represented everything antithetical to his worldview. They were internationalists who rejected national and ethnic identities in favor of class solidarity. They were atheists who scorned the religious traditions of the Caucasus. They were revolutionaries who sought to overturn the social hierarchies that had given men like Sultan their status. Most fundamentally, they were centralizers who intended to rebuild the Russian state under a new ideology, one that left no room for the autonomy or independence that Caucasian nationalists dreamed of restoring. Sultan joined the White Army, the loose coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces that fought the Reds across the former Russian Empire from 1918 to 1922. He commanded cavalry units in southern Russia, leading his men in the brutal, chaotic fighting that defined the Russian Civil War. It was a conflict of extraordinary savagery, where armies dissolved and reformed, where entire regions changed hands multiple times, where atrocities were commonplace and mercy rare. The Whites fought not as a unified force, but as a collection of factions united mainly by their opposition to Bolshevism. There were monarchists who wanted to restore the Tsar, liberals who wanted a democratic Russia, nationalists who wanted independent states carved from the empire's periphery. Sultan's motivations aligned most closely with the last group. He fought not to restore the old empire, but to ensure that the Caucasus would never again be subordinated to Moscow, whether under a Tsar or a Commissar. But the Whites lost. Despite early successes, despite support from foreign powers, despite the Bolsheviks' own internal divisions and economic collapse, the Red Army prevailed. By 1922, organized white resistance had been crushed. Those who could fled into exile. Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu was among them. He left Russia and entered the diaspora, that scattered community of émigrés who gathered in Paris, Berlin, Istanbul, and a dozen other cities, nursing their grievances and plotting their return. Exile was a strange existence for men like Sultan. They were soldiers without an army, nationalists without a nation. They spent their days in cafes and meeting halls, forming committees and organizations with grand names and no power. Sultan threw himself into this world. He became active in various Caucasian émigré groups, organizations dedicated to the cause of Caucasian independence. These groups published newspapers, held conferences, lobbied foreign governments, and maintained networks of contacts inside the Soviet Union. Their ultimate goal was the secession of the Caucasus from the Soviet state, the creation of independent republics for the Circassians, Chechens, Dagestanis, and other mountain peoples. It was a dream sustained more by determination than by realistic prospects, but for Sultan and men like him, it was all they had. The 1920s and 30s passed. The Soviet Union consolidated its power, industrialized at a breakneck pace, survived famine and purges, and the paranoia of Stalin's rule. The émigré community aged, its members dying off or assimilating into their host countries, its revolutionary fervor dimming into nostalgia. But Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu did not give up. He maintained his contacts, attended his meetings, kept the flame alive. And then, in June 1941, everything changed. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, was the largest military operation in history. 3 million German and Axis troops smashed across the Soviet border, driving deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. For Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu, now in his 60s, this was the moment he had waited 2 decades for. The Soviet Union, the hated Bolshevik state, was reeling under the German onslaught. Here, finally, was the opportunity to strike back, to liberate the Caucasus, to achieve the independence that had eluded his people for a century and a half. Sultan made his choice. He sided with Nazi Germany. It was a decision that would define the rest of his life and seal his fate. But in the context of 1941, it was not as straightforward as it might appear in hindsight. Sultan was not a Nazi. He had no particular affinity for Hitler's ideology, no commitment to racial theories or the New Order. But he was willing to work with anyone who might help him achieve his goal. The enemy of my enemy, as the saying goes, is my friend. For Sultan and many other Caucasian nationalists, the Wehrmacht represented not liberation in the Nazi sense, but simply the destruction of Soviet power. What came after could be negotiated. First, the Bolsheviks had to be defeated. The Germans, for their part, were pragmatic. They needed collaborators, men who could help them govern occupied territories, recruit local forces, and pacify resistance. The Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic empire, and the Germans understood that ethnic tensions could be exploited. They encouraged the formation of collaborationist units from Soviet prisoners of war, and from populations that had grievances against Moscow. Ukrainians, Cossacks, Balts, Caucasians, all were recruited into auxiliary formations. These units served in various capacities, from rear area security to anti-partisan operations to frontline combat. Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu became deeply involved in this effort. Following orders from Berlin, he worked on creating collaborationist formations from Caucasian prisoners of war and from those who voluntarily defected to the German side. He helped organize, train, and command these units. He also personally led Caucasian formations in anti-partisan campaigns in Yugoslavia, where German forces were struggling to suppress Tito's communist partisans and various nationalist militias. The fighting in Yugoslavia was vicious, characterized by ambushes, reprisals, and atrocities on all sides. Sultan's units were part of the German effort to maintain control over the Balkans, a task that consumed vast resources and achieved only limited success. Then came the summer of 1942, and with it the German offensive into the Caucasus. Army Group South drove toward the oil fields of Baku, the strategic prize that Hitler believed would fuel the German war machine and cripple the Soviet Union. German troops pushed through the Kuban and into the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. For Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu, this was the culmination of his hopes. The Germans had reached his homeland. The liberation, as he saw it, was at hand. Sultan traveled to the North Caucasus, to the territories inhabited by his fellow Adagians, the Circassian people to whom he belonged. His role was primarily propagandistic. He made speeches to the local population, urging them to support the Germans, to rise up against the Bolsheviks, to join the war of liberation. He presented the German invasion not as a conquest, but as an opportunity, a chance to throw off Soviet rule and reclaim autonomy. He invoked history, heritage, and the suffering inflicted by Stalin's regime, including the deportations and collectivization that had devastated Caucasian communities. But the German advance stalled. At Stalingrad, hundreds of miles to the north, the Wehrmacht became locked in a battle of annihilation with the Red Army. The city on the Volga became a meat grinder, consuming entire divisions. By late 1942, it was clear that the Germans could advance no further. In November, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, encircling the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. In February 1943, the survivors surrendered, a catastrophic defeat that marked the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. The German forces in the Caucasus, now in danger of being cut off, began a hasty retreat. Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu's propaganda mission became moot. The Germans were leaving, and the Red Army was coming back. In this moment of collapse, Sultan's mask slipped. In private conversations with locals, he became brutally honest about the situation. He told them that his fate was sealed, that he had bound his life to the Germans and would die with them if necessary. But he advised the Caucasians not to follow his example. He told them to shout their support for the Germans if they must, but to remember that German power in the region was temporary. The Bolsheviks were stronger. The Bolsheviks would return, and anyone who openly collaborated would be destroyed. It was a remarkable admission, a moment of clarity and resignation. Sultan understood that his gamble had failed. The Germans were not going to win the war. The Soviet Union would survive, and with it, the Bolshevik regime he had spent his life opposing. His dream of Caucasian independence was over. All that remained was to survive as long as possible and hope for a miracle that would never come. The war ground on for 2 more years. The Red Army pushed the Germans back across Ukraine, across Poland, into Germany itself. Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu retreated with the German forces, ending up in Austria as the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945. With him were tens of thousands of other collaborators, Cossacks, who had fought for the Germans along with their families. They surrendered to British forces, hoping that the Western Allies would protect them from Soviet retribution. They were wrong. In early June 1945, the British made a decision that remains controversial to this day. They handed over the Cossacks and other Soviet collaborators to the Red Army, despite knowing what awaited them. The Yalta Conference had established protocols for the repatriation of Soviet citizens, and the British interpreted these protocols broadly. The handover, known as the Betrayal of the Cossacks or the Tragedy of Drau, saw tens of thousands of men, women, and children forcibly returned to Soviet custody. Many committed suicide rather than face Soviet justice. Others were shot immediately. The rest were sent to the Gulag, or to trial. Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu was among those handed over. He was transported back to Moscow, imprisoned and interrogated. The Soviet state had not forgotten him. His activities during the Civil War, his work with émigré organizations, his collaboration with the Germans, all of it was documented and catalogued. He was charged with treason against the fatherland, counter-revolutionary activities, and subversive terrorist activities against the USSR. The charges were not fabrications. Sultan had indeed fought against the Soviet state, had indeed collaborated with Nazi Germany, had indeed worked to undermine Soviet power. By any legal standard, he was guilty. The trial took place in January 1947, nearly 2 years after the war's end. By this time, the Soviet Union had conducted numerous trials of collaborators, sentencing thousands to death or to long terms in the labor camps. Sultan's trial was not particularly notable in the context of this broader campaign, except for his lineage. The Soviet press made much of the fact that a descendant of Genghis Khan, a representative of the old nobility, had been exposed as a traitor. It fit neatly into the Soviet narrative of class struggle, the idea that the old ruling classes were inherently hostile to the socialist state and would always side with its enemies. On January 16, 1947, Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu was hanged. The method of execution was significant. The Soviet Union typically used shooting for executions, reserving hanging for those deemed particularly heinous traitors. Sultan's death by hanging was a final humiliation, a public statement of his treachery. He was 70 years old, a lifetime removed from the world into which he had been born, a world of empires and khans and cavalry charges. He died in a world of superpowers and ideologies and total war, a world that had no place for men like him. The story of Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu is more than a tale of one man's choices and their consequences. It is a window into the broader tragedy of collaboration during the Second World War, a phenomenon that affected every occupied country and that continues to provoke difficult questions. Why did people collaborate? What were their motivations? How should they be judged? For Sultan, the motivations were clear. He was a nationalist who believed that the Soviet Union was an illegitimate oppressor of the Caucasian peoples. He saw the German invasion as an opportunity to achieve independence, even if it meant allying with a regime that was, in its own way, as brutal as the one he opposed. He was not alone in this calculation. Across the occupied Soviet territories, millions of people faced similar choices. Some collaborated out of conviction, others out of coercion, still others out of simple survival. The lines between resistance, accommodation, and collaboration were often blurred. The Soviet response to collaboration was unforgiving. Stalin viewed any cooperation with the enemy as treason, regardless of circumstances. Entire ethnic groups were deported for alleged collaboration, including the Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, and others from the Caucasus and Crimea. Hundreds of thousands died in these deportations. Individual collaborators who survived the war faced execution or the Gulag. The Soviet state did not distinguish between those who had committed atrocities and those who had simply served in auxiliary roles. All were guilty. In the decades since, historians have debated how to assess collaboration. Some argue that collaborators like Sultan were traitors who aided one of history's most evil regimes. Others contend that the situation was more complex, that people made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, that motivations matter. Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu fought against the Bolsheviks not because he supported Nazism, but because he wanted independence for his people. Does that make his collaboration more understandable, if not excusable? What is clear is that Sultan's choices led directly to his death. Had he remained in exile, doing nothing, he might have lived out his days in obscurity. Had he refused to collaborate, he would have had no role in the events he had spent his life hoping for. But he chose action, and that action placed him on the side of Nazi Germany, a regime responsible for the deaths of tens of millions. When the Soviets won, as they did, there could be only one outcome. The execution of Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu also symbolizes the end of an era. He was a link to the pre-revolutionary world, to the age of empires and traditional hierarchies. His ancestry connected him to Genghis Khan, to the Mongol conquests, to a time when lineage determined destiny. But the 20th century was the age of ideology, not bloodline. The Soviet Union cared nothing for Sultan's descent from Khans and conquerors. To the Soviet state, he was simply a class enemy and a traitor. And his execution was a demonstration that the old world was dead and would not return. In the end, Sultan Kılıçdaroğlu's story is a reminder of the costs of choosing the wrong side in a total war, and of the particular tragedy that befell those who believed they could use one totalitarian regime to defeat another. His gamble failed, as it was almost certain to do. The Soviet Union proved stronger than Nazi Germany, and those who had bet against it paid the price. Sultan's execution was not an aberration, but part of a systematic campaign to eliminate those who had opposed Soviet power. It was justice by the standards of the victors, and in the brutal calculus of the Second World War and its aftermath, the victors were the only ones whose standards mattered.